Hey folks, so I thought tonight we'd continue. Last week we looked at the XS20 and the latest Fuji firmware updates. I can't obviously test the X-H2S, which I think a lot of people have been doing videos about, but I have an XT5 and I also have an XS20. So I thought this time, as the XT5 is my main camera for bird and wildlife photography, and portrait photography, we have a look at that. So one of the most recent sort of little jobs I've done is some portrait photography, and I was using the XF50 to 140 f2.8 lens, and I just put the new autofocus on. It literally came out a day or two before I did the shoot, so I thought, well, let's give this a try. And for the most part, the images that came out were beautifully tack sharp, but the photo shoot was on the beach. And you might think, well, does that make a difference? It shouldn't make a difference, but one of the newer features that they've added to the autofocus was the ability to detect multiple faces in a picture. And it does and it does not have its usefulness. Now, if you're taking pictures of friends, family, you might want to choose the face to focus on, or if it's a busy background, but I kind of made an assumption, should never assume things, that it would pick the face that was closest to it. Now, I'll bring up a screenshot here, which will show you a picture I took. And the subject missed focus. And I think, why did it miss focus? So fortunately, you can review a photograph on Fuji cameras and you can see which autofocus point it chose. And if you don't choose an autofocus point, I was reading about this, the camera chooses it for you. I don't know what parameters it uses to choose it for you, but it chooses it. Now, for some reason, it chose the furthest away person in the shot. Quite why it did that, I don't know. And I think, in reality, the XT5, which is classed as a semi-professional, if not professional camera, dual card slots, etc., weather resistant, probably shouldn't be doing that. It probably should pick the foreground subject. I can understand that from a camera like the XS20, which is aimed as a prosumer camera, it's kind of designed more for holiday snaps, although it's a good camera. You might want it to have a good guess. You take a holiday snap on the beach, you probably want it to photograph on not what's in the foreground, but what's in the background. Maybe that's what they thought when they did the algorithm. I think though what we need is the ability to turn it off, or to have a setting for focus on what's in the foreground, focus what's in the background, and maybe have an alert up if it's not sure, you know, put a red box around the screen when it's like, oh, we don't know what face to focus on, or there's a problem, or to alert you that it's detected multiple faces. When you're in a quick fire situation and you're trying to get a shot because the light's right, you might have checked all the other settings, but you know, once upon a time you never needed to have this. Was never an issue because you would put a zone over the face of the person and it would just detect what was in that. If it had face eye on, it would do that. And that's one way of doing it. But I was trusting the camera on the area mode. I wasn't using, I think the zone, I don't think I was using zone at the time. And I think that's a workaround, but it still just seems on stills mode to detect things outside of that. Now video is really different, and we're going to move on to that and talk about video in a minute. But I just thought I'd wrap up the still side with saying, yes, the autofocus is much sharper, and when it gets a hit, it's a lot more accurate. There isn't this sort of focusing behind and in front. But one caveat to that, and I can't show you it because obviously I wasn't recording the camera output, but when I was focusing with the camera, obviously you've got the heads-up display, I'm pretty certain I had a green eye box over the subject, which was the model in the foreground in the picture I'm showing you, which is out of focus. I'm pretty certain that I took umpteen pictures like this, and every time the camera was putting a box around the subject in the foreground with the eye box, and I'm thinking, great, I've got it's in focus, great, it's in focus, snap the shot, it's in focus, snap the shot. And the camera's not giving me the correct, it's giving me accurate information because there was an eye and a head in focus, just not the one I wanted. And I need to have clearer information what the camera is focusing on. And it wasn't doing that. And we need that. And I think that's what's missing from this latest update. More professional features, please, Fuji. This is not a prosumer camera. It's a camera that professionals want to use. And I don't want to be distracted. If the face eye box is telling me that I've got the subject in focus, I'm going to take the shot. And then if it turns out that you've focused on something else, but I didn't know. So I think there's a bug there. I think there's a bug in the update. They've got the accuracy. It was definitely focusing accurately when I did get most of the shots where there wasn't a person in the background, the camera has generally, the vast majority of the time, nailed the focus. Very rarely do I get these soft shots. So it's definitely better. But that was certainly a major bug that I've noticed, that it would tell you that it was focusing on a particular face in the foreground, and then when you actually reviewed the pictures, it hadn't. It had focused on something completely different, to the point where, as you saw from the example I brought up, the little green box note on this example, the little green box is actually on the subject in the background. It actually had focused correctly as far as the camera's concerned. But it would be nice to have the ability to turn that feature off, tell it to favour subjects in the foreground, because when you're photographing a model, and you want to maybe get things in the background, the subject is generally the larger subject physically in the viewfinder. So any AI in the camera should be trainable to take that into account and go, favour foreground subjects or favour primary subject in the foreground. So more advanced tools there I think would help. But it's a move in the right direction. You can work around it once you're aware of it by using zones, zone autofocus, because there's a lot of customization in Fuji stills autofocus. Use zone autofocus. Make sure your zone is over the subject so that if the eye face has an issue, it shouldn't then start detecting, and be sure that the box is green when you take the subject and review, and just be mindful of, if you're taking a portrait in a busy background and there's lots of people around, that wait until the past, otherwise the camera may get confused. Definitely needs fixing, but overall I've had much better success than the previous firmware. Not that I had a huge problem, but I had far more hits when it worked. It was great when it worked, when the busy back, because a lot of the pictures I was taking didn't have people in the background. And those ones, it was nailing it. It missed the odd one, but the vast majority were fine. Anyway, let's look at video autofocus and the different modes in wildlife. So, video autofocus. So I've done a few tests, and the lenses used, I've got my notes down here, so if I look down, that's what I'm doing. I'm not very good at remembering things. So I've used my XF 100-400 and my XF 50-140 f2.8 lenses. These are two lenses I predominantly use for wildlife. My 50-140 is also my go-to lens for portraits as well. So when I bring up a sample on the screen, I'll bring up a little caption with it to explain the lens that took that and the autofocus mode as I talk about them. And I'm going to bring the examples up as I talk through them. So first of all, we've got a lot of different modes we looked at. The Fuji autofocus has multi, wide tracking and area, and I tested all three of those with the subject detect on, and then we just looked at area autofocus with subject detect off, because that's the closest type of autofocus you get to zone autofocus on stills, where you've got a modicum of control over the size of the box and where you place it on the screen, so you can control where the camera is going to focus. So we'll bring up multi first, and what I've noticed straight away is that once the camera has locked the subject on, it works really well. And I also noticed that on the examples of the XF100 to 400 lens, all the samples that I did were using the full range of focus. These long lenses have a focus switch, which allows you to limit the focal range. So they're the full range. The subjects were about 10 meters away, and I was focusing on things anywhere from 10 meters to infinity. So we looked at multi, and in multi it was picking up the subject, but it seems to be too sticky. It's very accurate, as you can see, when it's locked on, but when you try to move off the subject area and focus, say there was you go, oh, there's a bird over there on a branch that's 5 meters behind. I would like to refocus on that and record that. It won't focus on it on this long lens. And I thought, well, all right, we'll switch to tracking, because we can toggle the tracking on and off. And the tracking, again, it's pretty accurate once it's locked on. You can lock the tracking onto the subject and it will track it if it can't detect a face or an eye. Equally, it will detect a face and an eye. Weirdly, with the tracking mode, it'll only detect a face or an eye within the tracking box. So if the tracking box moves off the head of the bird, it'll no longer detect a face or an eye. But if you've locked on to the face and the eye, it will track it all over like multi. I kind of think that's by design, because obviously it needs to focus in where you're tracking. But it would be nice for it to have a mode, and take a leaf out of Lumex's book, where you can have, on Lumex I've got like a mode of tracking +1, I think they call it. And what it is, you get a box that you can move around the screen, and then it's got another box around the outside of it where it'll still look for a subject to track. So that you've got more flexibility in the tracking modes. There's kind of like a bit of a dead zone around the tracking point where it'll still pick things up. But on Lumix cameras, I find that multi works pretty well. We're on multi here. I've given it a bit more of a challenging lens because we're on the 50mm f1.8. It's a very shallow depth of field, so if it loses autofocus, I'll find out when I review this. But I'm still filming it at the minute, obviously. But if I look over at my monitor here, I can see that it's got a crossover my eye. So the Lumix S52X doing what seems to be quite a nice job of locking on in its video multi-mode. And this is what I would expect of Fuji. And indeed, I think this is poignant to bring up a quick little example of the S5 while we're looking at the Fuji samples, to see how easily in a similar mode, in multi-mode, it moves around and it locks onto the subject. You move the camera's point of focus somewhere else, and it focuses on what it thinks it should do. And it does. It quickly changed focus. It got stuck briefly, but it realised there was something there. And this is on a third-party lens where you're not getting the full capacity of the phase detect autofocus. You're getting a mixture of phase detect and DFD. Because I'm not using a native lens when I use my Sigma 100 to 400. Like I said, the autofocus update on the S52X was like incredible. It took the autofocus from just not working in video to working. And the Lumix took a year to bring that out nearly. Because obviously the S52 came out well before, and it took a long time before the autofocus started to work, and now it's pretty good. I was taking some shots the other day, quite close up to the lens, tack sharp, of little fledgling birds. Bring one up here, hopping around on the ground, and ISO 6400. I mean, the detail's incredible. So, you know, you've got to take hats off to Lumix. They've got it's a cracking camera, this. But I've digressed. Let's move to area autofocus. Again, subject detect is still on with the area autofocus. And area is a little bit like a combination. It's a mix between tracking and multi, but area is like zone in stills. You have a box where you can control the size of it. You can make it very small, like a pinpoint. And this is the mode I think should have a bit of an extra addition to it, where you can have a gap around the box to give it a bit of leeway. And you can make the box tiny, so you can put it just over the eye of a bird and it'll focus on that, and it makes the autofocus more accurate. It should do, in theory. But again, as you can see, it was brilliant on the subject, but as soon as you moved away, it was like not focusing at all. Or if it did focus, then it wouldn't come back. So you move back to the subject and it was either picking it up straight away because it hadn't changed the focus, or you'd move it away and it wouldn't refocus on what you moved it away from. So it is more accurate, for sure. And if you're just focusing on one subject, it's really good. You know, I was focusing on this blackbird and it was just sitting on a leaf, on a branch with some leaves blowing in front of it, and the camera was happy. But as soon as I moved off, it lost. And I'd even changed this one to ignore things close to the camera. So the switch on the 100-400 was set to 5 meters to infinity because the tree was about 10 meters from me. And it didn't really make much of a difference. You know, it was a little bit better. And I'm going to go over into some examples like this next. So we're going to look now at using it without subject detect. And then we'll look at it with area, but with the 5 meter to infinity mode set. So exactly the same tests as before. Really, we're going to look at the subject of our friendly pigeon here, and locks on no problem with area because it's like zone. And I thought, well, because it's not looking for subject, maybe it should detect what's under the zone when I move it behind. Not really. It did pick up things that were a bit closer, that were sort of within the same focal range. Now that might have been to do with the 100-400, but it didn't pick up things at the distance. And when we did the same test with the XF 50-140, it wasn't having a problem. And obviously it was a day after when I did this test, so I didn't have a bird, but I was able to focus on the lamp, focus on some foliage, focus on something at the distance, and then cycle between them. And the 50-140 didn't have a problem with this. It is a faster focusing lens, and I suspect had I done the test with the bird, I would have got better results. So this could be to do with the lens. However, I don't remember my 100-400 doing this before. So again, it's better. And from the point of view of sticking to what you want to take a picture of or what you want to focus on, when you are recording, which generally with wildlife you are, I'm giving this extreme tests, you know, you're not going to flail the camera around like this generally. It was pretty good. And indeed, one of the tests I did with the camera, with tracking on, was for the pigeon to be walking around on my driveway, and the camera was doing a fine job with 100-400 of tracking the pigeon, keeping it in focus. And the pigeons are actually really hard to track because their heads bob up and down. They're actually a good subject to test. They don't move very fast, so they're easy to track with a camera on a tripod, but their heads bob up and down. So because their heads bob up and down, the camera has a hard time keeping the eye, which is what it's looking for. But it was all right. I was moving around, and the camera was only having to make small adjustments with the depth of the focus, so it was fine. And it just seems that the Lumix cameras, as a comparison, when we showed you that earlier, they just have they're just a little bit better at doing that. You could argue it's not a fair comparison because 100 to 400 on a Fuji is different to 100 to 400 on a full frame camera. But I digress. So really, then the last thing I thought I'd test was, which we've gone into really, was the, as I say, the 5 meter to infinity test. And you've kind of seen that, in that it did give a minor improvement, but it was still getting stuck, as it were. Now the question is, to wrap up, now we've had a look at this, and we've gone through all the different autofocus modes, are Fuji moving in the right direction? What are my thoughts on this? They are moving in the right direction, and I've got to test stills because, remember I said a year ago I was able to take pictures of swallows with this 100 to 400 lens. I was able to take pictures of swallows in flight. Now this is the time of year that we get swallows and swifts, so I'm going to have to go out and see by next week whether I can attempt to get some pictures of these swallows and swifts and see if I can get the same shots I did before. Because it's a very difficult scenario for the camera to do, because the very thing that it's struggling with, which is the depth of the focus, is very difficult because a swallow can come rapidly towards you. And the camera has to realise that that blurry object is something to focus on. And this is where it seems to be having trouble. They've certainly improved the accuracy. And if you're the kind of person who wants to sit and film a bird on a branch that's just doing its thing, sure, it'll work nicely. And indeed, when I've tested the autofocus update prior, a few weeks ago, that's when I was a bit naive and only tested that and then reported to you guys, oh, this is a wonderful autofocus update. It works really well. It still works really well for that. It's nice and accurate, locks on. They've certainly improved the still side of things. A few caveats that you can work around that could be fixed in firmware, but it's now accurate. But what they need to improve is somehow give us the ability for it to break the focus, even if it means it does a long hunt. You know, when it goes all blurry and there's nothing, obviously the subject, the camera that needs to do a rack to go, oh, I can't, there's nothing in this that's in focus, do a full rack of the focus and go zzz, like focus should, and go, oh, I can lock onto that. Because it's plainly obvious that when the subject's gone, the blurry outline of the lamppost is gone, and there's just a green mass, that there's something there. And the AI must go, well, nothing's sharp in the image, so I need to rack my focus all the way to one extreme and then all the way back to the other to see if anything comes into focus. And that's what it seems not to be able to do. It seems to have this, that the Fuji have gone too far the other way. And it is frustrating because I'm slowly starting to build into semi-professional photography work, and I need a reliable camera. And I've invested a lot of my money into Fuji kit. I do shoot Lumix, but I don't have the required kit really with my Lumix cameras to do anything more than video work like this. My Lumix cameras are generally like more studio oriented, and portrait work, again, I've only got a 50mm lens, so I like to have something equivalent to, I love having the Fuji equivalent to a 70 to 200 on a full frame. I like having that range because it gives me a lot of flexibility. I found that the zoom is nicer than a prime because on a beach shoot, you can take shots that you necessarily couldn't get in that position because they're swinging in the way. I do like primes, I love them, but I need to know that the cameras I'm working with are going to be reliable. and it does give you food for thought. Fuji do need to sort this out, because there's lovely things like Real Ace has come along, and I absolutely adore Real Ace. And all these clips you've seen have been recorded in Real Ace straight out of camera, and I love the look out of camera. It's just such a nice look. I think it's better than a Turner in some respects, because it's a out of camera look that you can just take and just use without doing it, because I like to shoot things that way, if you like. Just looking at how much time I've got left for recording. 10 minutes. I like stuff to do out of camera. I don't mind colour grading, but sometimes when you press for time, you haven't got time to colour grade. So we're just going to have to keep an eye on this, I think, because I said I'd do a much more extensive test. I said I'd report back my findings over the coming weeks. And there's definitely some positives to come from it. But there are definitely some negatives. There are some problems with video still with these two lenses. I'm sure if I stuck a 50 to, an 18 to 50 on, the problems would not be quite so obvious. And indeed, when I recorded my talking heads on the XS20, which essentially is the same autofocusing engine, it's just a different sensor. It's the same technology in the camera. The XS20 is essentially an XT5, just with an older sensor in it. It's just as powerful. It's just in a much smaller body. I didn't have any problems. In fact, the only issue I had, if you probably noticed from last week, was the audio. God knows what it was doing, but the audio was peaking like mad. I did make a few mistakes myself of not choosing the correct noise gate, and I was able to correct it, but I think I was in such a hurry that I just sort of pasted on my standard go-to noise removal profile, where I just go, right, audio, bang, tweak it for Fuji. It sounded okay. I was half asleep when I did it. It was really late at night. It's a little bit earlier now. It's still daylight. And it was awful when I put it up there, and the following morning I watched it, I think, God, that's terrible. And somebody was like commented and said, your audio's awful. And they were right, it was terrible. So I just sort of like hold my hands up and go, yeah, it is. It's dreadful. So I'm sorry the audio was so bad last week, folks. We're back on the S5, for which I have a profile, so I hope it's a lot better this week. Audio's, I'm still a bit of a novice when it comes to audio and getting levels right. I have fairly limited kit as well. This is a very old Rode wireless Go mic. An audio kit's quite expensive, and I do need to get some better mics and some newer mics, and I will do. But with house purchases pending and searching, I don't have much spare capital for camera kit, and if anything, I'll be selling camera kit to go towards a deposit on a house. So unless something amazing happens financially, yeah. Anyway, I digress. So I think Fuji are probably going to have to push out a new update. It's improved enough to be workable. Now I can work with it. And like I say, I wouldn't tend to be messing around with the autofocus that much. And I could get around the autofocus issue by having the combination of manual and autofocus on, where I can go, right, it's not moving, just give it a kick with the manual focus and then get it to autofocus again. It just gets stuck. But it got me thinking, and this is what I thought I want to leave you with. And this is where I want to hear your comments, especially Fuji users, but also if you shoot Sony. Not that many of you probably will, because I've predominantly been a Fuji channel. But I would shoot any camera. I own a ZV-1, it's a cracking little camera. And of course, Lumix users. Have you had issues with your autofocus, but especially here from the Fuji people? Because one of the things I nearly didn't buy Lumix when I got my Lumix cameras about a year ago. Cut that. Oh, the phone rang. So maybe it's a bit darker, but it's now a bit later. Anyway, I was just summing up the review, folks. It was a lovely rainbow formed outside. I wish I could get a picture of that, but I can't. Yeah, maybe I might get some B-roll. I think what I was saying about the problems is it gives you food for thought whether you start to look at the likes of Sony, who've always been the brand leaders in photography. And I think that's where, if any people are Sony shooters, it'd be nice to hear from them as to any issues that they face with their autofocus. It almost makes me want to hire a camera from Sony, like the new A7 IV, and just see how it performs. Because it is frustrating when things don't work. So for now, we'll keep monitoring with Fuji and see how the autofocus goes. But look forward to reading any comments on the autofocus, because I want to see what are the problems people have had with it, or indeed if they haven't had problems. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. Anyway, folks, thanks for bearing with me this far. It's been a long one. It's a 25-minute this, so it's quite a long episode on the sofa. And I will hope we catch you all next week. It's probably going to be Thursday morning before this one gets out. Countless delays. It always is the way of things. But I had to film quite a lot of B-roll, as you've seen. See you later. Bye.